Well, welcome everyone to the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice and our continuing conversation on racial healing and reconciliation. We have a special guest tonight, Richmond Wynn from the University of North Florida. I will let him further introduce himself. And also with us are Jamie Krasnogor and our president, Richard Danford, and also William Malone, who is a major driver for this monthly conversation. I also wanted to mention that we have a conference on racial healing and reconciliation coming up October 27th. It's a virtual conference, national. It is no charge and supported by some very helpful local support, and we encourage you to join. And I'll put a link to that in the chat during the presentation. With that, I'd like to ask Dr. Wynn if he wouldn't get started.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Good evening. It's good to be with you again. I'll say I don't know that I've actually been with with some of you before, but I've certainly been with the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice in the past. So I actually have, I do have a bit of a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. Although I'm a professor, one of my roles is professor at UNF, I don't do a lot of PowerPointing to people, but it might help just to frame to offer some thoughts on my framework and my thinking. So I'll probably just skip through some slides in just a moment. I'll just say a little bit about my connection and my role at UNF, my current role at UNF. So I've been at the University of North Florida for 22 years. I am a licensed mental health counselor by training, and I started at UNF as a staff counselor in the counseling center, and then I became a full-time professor, and then I went back to the counseling center to be their director for a couple of years. And just recently, earlier this year, I became the Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer. And this role as Chief Diversity Officer really is a full circle moment for me, as I have spent a lot of time in community engagement in social justice and diversity, equity, inclusion work. My research is all about intersectionality of identity and social justice. And I have done a lot of work both on campus and off campus in the DEI space. So to be at this place at the University of North Florida, where my responsibilities include recruitment and retention of diverse students, faculty, and staff, but also to help us evolve our culture on campus to be more inclusive and more welcoming, and including nurturing our relationships with our community partners, is really a culmination, I think, of a lot of the work that I've done professionally and personally. So personally, I identify as Black. I also identify as gay, and that has been an interesting road to travel these years. I grew up in a very religious environment, a Judeo-Christian environment. I was fortunate. I didn't know it at the time, but I look back now and I realized that I was fortunate to grow up in a very religious, Christian religious household that had two expressions of the Christian faith. My father was grew up in a Pentecostal religion, Pentecostal faith, and my mother was more Baptist, traditional Baptist. I call it white glove Baptist. And she laughs when I say that, because she was an usher in church and they wore white gloves. I don't know, that just stuck out in my mind. And so they were very more prim, proper, sang out of hymnals. My father's church was not that. it was, if you know much about the Pentecostal faith or the holiness expression of Christianity, it's much more lively, less structured. And one of the features that stood out to me as a young child is that my father's church stayed in for hours upon hours upon hours, whereas my mother's church did not. So that matters because as a young person, I was always a questioner. I always wanted to know why. Why was always, a question that I asked about everything. And so, while my parents would often go to different churches because of their different faiths, and over time they would go to church together, and sometimes they go to church separately. But I got to see two very different expressions of the same faith. We use the same book, the same deity, we are the same prophet, yet the experiences were very different. And I say that was a benefit now, reflecting back as an adult, because I was able to embrace the idea that my faith could be different, and it didn't have to be just what my parents taught me, or just what anybody else taught me, or what I heard in church. And that has taken me a long way. Today, I identify more as a spiritual person. I'm not necessarily connected religiously, and I'm very open, and I approach religion from a more of an academic perspective. I'm very curious about religion. If you could get closer to some of the books behind me, you would see that several of them have to deal with religion and faith and spirituality. So I'm very invested in my spiritual self, and I have religion in a place that I respect it, but it's not necessarily the primary force or driving force in my life. Because of who I am and how I grew up, there became a point where I began to realize that I was a little different from a lot of my peers and even my other siblings. And because of the faith that I grew up in, there wasn't really a clear space for me to express to even identify. I didn't know the word gay. I didn't express myself or identify that way. And as I began to understand, who I was and who I was attracted to, I also realized that was not acceptable in my circle, in my family, in my religious community. And so that led to a lot of shame and a lot of guilt and a lot of isolation, even in the midst of my community, my family community, my church community. I also grew up at a time when I was born in 1967, so I grew up in the 70s, and this still was a time when acts of racism were prominent, and to be honest, they still are today, actually, but they look differently then. One story that sticks out in my mind is going to a little five and dime store in our community called Ben Franklin, an early version of what we might maybe like a Walgreens or Target or whatever. And every time we would go to that store, we were followed by the white manager, and just followed around the store constantly. And my mother would point out that we were being followed, and to be careful and not to do anything that would draw any attention to us, and just know that we were being followed and watched. My parents had, in my room, there were clippings of the newspaper of when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered, when John Kennedy was murdered, and all of these news clippings were in my room on the top shelf in the closet. And I would read those clippings periodically, and even though I had seen them several times, I would pull them out often and read them. And there was a real connection. It felt real emotional connection to the story of these powerful people whose lives were taken because of of hatred when Roots was aired on television, the multi-night airing of Roots. We watched it as a family, and it was both enlightening and eye-opening and extremely painful to connect with that part of my own history. I went to predominantly white schools and was often the only person of color in my class, or maybe the one of two people of color in my class. Colorism was something that stood out to me because within the Black community, at that time being darker skinned was less attractive, was viewed as less attractive than people who were lighter skinned. I clearly remember one day in a middle school class sitting next to a friend who was very, very dark, much darker than me. And I remember holding my arm up against his and hoping he wasn't aware of what I was doing, but I was comparing levels of darkness, and I was comparing my skin to his, and felt relieved that he was actually darker than me. So I look back at those things and those experiences and realized that they both shaped and influenced my feelings about myself and my beliefs about myself, and at that time had more of a negative impact on my self-worth and identity, and then also contributed to my resilience. I don't know if it's something, a part of me and my personality that I was born with, or it probably was a combination of that and my parents' support and coaching, and they were very caring and supportive of me and my siblings, that said, despite these challenges, so the challenges in terms of experiences of race and microaggressions and things in our community and things that I had internalized about my own race and my own skin color, and the challenges that I was dealing with very personally with my own sexual orientation. Again, I didn't really know that phrase at the time, but it was very isolating. And it's what I know now is that I was experiencing what we call now as was experiencing this intersectionality of identity, and experiencing the compounding effects of growing up with two very marginalized and oppressed identities. So to say a little bit about intersectionality or oppression, actually, oppression is seen in many ways. In fact, let me pause for a moment and just share my screen briefly. I do want to just touch on a few concepts, if you will, and I promise I will not bore you to death with PowerPoint, but I think it might be helpful for me, instead of just free flowing this, and just to have a little bit of structure around this. So oppression is the systemic and pervasive, routine and institutionalized mistreatment of individuals on the basis of their membership in varying social identity groups. It's the ongoing invalidation, denial, and non-recognition of complete humanity of people who belong to these groups. So I'd like to, remind myself and others that in order for discrimination and oppression to take place, you must first dehumanize the target of discrimination. Because if we saw everyone as completely human and equal, there's no way we could mistreat people. So first and foremost, we have to dehumanize people, or the targets of oppression. And this happens on individual level. It happens in groups. It also happens in institutions and in systems like our laws and our justice system. This quote says, yes, racism looks like hate, but hate is just one manifestation. Racism shows up in privilege and access or denial of access and ignorance and apathy and so on. While Scott Woods, who this quote comes from, says that I agree that no one is really born racist. It's a powerful system that we're immediately born into. Think about the history of our country in particular. And just like being born into air, you take it in as soon as you breathe. And that doesn't mean that we necessarily hold on to that, or that we, as we evolve and grow, that we embrace and practice racist beliefs, but it is a fact of our experience here in this country. Researchers have been talking about this for years, and they've talked about how being exposed to oppression, and particularly from racism and other forms of oppression, we'll talk about in a minute, leads to what's called traumatic stress. And so anyone who is a member of any stigmatized identity group has a potential to experience chronic stress. And that chronic stress can lead to very poor mental health outcomes. You see anxiety, substance abuse, depression, including suicidality, other physical poor health outcomes like hypertension and heart disease, and so on and so forth. We also know that belonging to multiple stigmatized identity groups can be very challenging, even debilitating. So it's this cumulative effect, and it's a constant piling on of stressors from belonging to all these groups that are pushed out to the margins and are not included and are dehumanized. The symptoms of traumatic stress is how we diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. You might have heard PTSD. The criteria for PTSD, these are criteria for PTSD. And researchers say that, so according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, PTSD is diagnosed when someone experiences has a life-threatening experience. And they give examples of like being in war, or being in a serious car accident, or maybe being robbed at a gunpoint or something. And while those things certainly, I think we all would agree, can lead to stress, what researchers have identified as being exposed over time to discrimination and oppression, regardless of why. So whether it's based on race, whether it's based on sexual orientation or gender identity or ability status, that being exposed to this level of stress over time can also rise to the level of PTSD. So some of the symptoms include this hypervigilance of being constantly on guard. You're constantly looking around and watching yourself and watching your back and wondering, am I safe? Am I going to be harmed? If I think about in recent years, many Black men have talked about experiencing this sense of hypervigilance when it comes to their interaction with police officers, or just when they see police driving down the street or pulling up behind them, even if they're not intending to stop one of us, but not knowing, given the many episodes in recent years, recent decades even, of police brutality toward men of color. Other forms of hypervigilance may show up when, for instance, with people who might identify as gay and not be out about that, or not be confident in that their identity, and they're constantly on guard of, are people going to find out who I am? Are people going to discriminate against me because of who I am? Depression is another symptom. Intrusive experiences, having constant flashbacks of these traumatic experiences, dissociating, having a cognitive disconnect from anything that might be remotely related to the traumatic experience. And defensive avoidance is like this, and just it's internal numbing and being emotionally distant and cold in order that our system kind of does this automatically in order to protect itself. Samuel Jackson said this a long time ago, and people know about the Klan and overt racism, but the killing of one's soul, little by little, day after day, is a lot worse than someone coming in your house and lynching you. Now, some people may disagree with that. Obviously, no one wants to be lynched, but the point here is that this constant sort of chipping away at your soul, day by day, little by little, has a very profound effect. So just maybe something that you're familiar with, the dominant and non-dominant groups. And I won't go through all of these. Dominant groups have power, they make the rules, they control the resources, decide who's in, who's out, are often seen as capable or given the benefit of the doubt, are seen as normal. Non-dominant groups, less power, have to follow rules, don't get to make the rules, are really considered on the out. They're, instead of given the benefit of the doubt, are seen as suspect, and will often be seen as given special privileges or exception when we speak out and say, hey, there's an injustice here. And the response is often, no one gets special, you don't get special treatment. And in the United States, these are some typical categories of dominant, non-dominant groups. So we think of the group identity of ability, status, age, class, ethnicity, race, gender identity, religion, sexual orientation, and look at some of these characteristics of who's in the in group and who's in the out group. So when it comes to ability, people who don't have any disabilities, and obviously people who have disabilities are on the margins or on the out. Upper middle class people are the in group, working class or people who are living in what we might consider poverty or with low resources are considered out. In our country, men are still in dominant groups, and those who identify as women or female are in non-dominant group. And you can see as you go down the list. And since we're talking about racial reconciliation, obviously we have long since recognized that the dominant group in our country are people who are seen as and identify as white, and people of color are often in the non-dominant group. And because I related to, in my particular story, early, religion and sexual orientation. So people who identify as Christian are in the in group, and people who identify as any other religion or non-religious, including atheists and agnostics, would be on the out. And then people who identify as heterosexual or straight would be on the in group, and all others are out. This is a little cartoon that really gives an example of what we might call microaggressions. And those microaggressions are these often unintentional acts of marginalization and bias. And many people will say, gosh, I didn't mean, if their intention is called to this, you might say, gosh, I didn't really mean to be harmful. It's because of being born into and living in this conditioning that promotes stereotypes about certain groups of people, and those stereotypes become embraced as normal. So the first one says, oh, is that your little brother? This one white person talking to another. And then a similar scenario with the Black girl, it says, oh, is that your son? The white girl is asked, well, what colleges have you applied to? And the Black girl is asked, well, will you be the first person in your family to graduate from high school? So the expectation is that, the Black people don't really graduate from high school. Will you be the first person to go to college? On the left, the white person is asked, "Did you have any kids?" And then on the Black woman on the right is this? It's just assumed that she has kids and that she has more than one. How many kids do you have? And then the last one is really interesting. This to see a woman with a child, and the question is, "What does your husband do?" And then the Black woman is the father still in the picture? So you see how these thoughts, and they might be well-meaning, but these are all based on assumptions, based on stereotypes. So I said earlier that oppression can have debilitating effects. It can compromise when you are experiencing oppression, and especially multiple, being a member of multiple oppressed groups. You might have compromised coping skills, negative health outcomes, decreased agency, but there's also resilience. And the human spirit is quite resilient. So in the face of adversity, we can have the capacity to navigate our way through the psychological and social and cultural, physical resources, and in a way that sustains our well-being, and negotiate for those resources to be provided and experienced in meaningful ways. So it's not all bleak. While I think it's important to work to continue to work to undo racism and other forms of oppression, there can be some positive outcomes. You may have seen this before in different forms, and I promise we're at the end of this. You may have seen this in different forms when it comes to social justice, and we look at we can identify equality as having unequal access to opportunities, and then for this whole equality approach is everyone gets the same thing, and you can see that even with everybody getting the kind of support, this access to this fruit on the tree, that there's still some who don't have as much access as others, even though they all got the same support resources in the ladder. And then the equity approach is that we customize the resources to hopefully give people who have been traditionally left out a little more access. So this person's ladder is a little taller, but still is not quite the same as the other person. But a justice approach, social justice, is actually fixing the system so that equal access is being offered. So the tree is leaning in these three examples, but in this case, we have devised a system to fix the tree so the tree is now accessible to all. The late, great Dr. Maya Angelou says that we all should know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, and that we must understand that all threads of the tapestry are equal in value, no matter what their color. So I'll stop sharing that to give us an opportunity to talk a little bit. So what are your thoughts? What do you think about all of that? And we can return to any of that as we need to.
I would like to ask, I've read recently that